Hey everyone! Today's First Chapter Friday is More Tales to Keep You Up at Night by Dan Poblocki. And Dan Poblocki writes really good, scary stories that just in general are really fast-paced, constant action. So he's a really, really great author if you're looking to expand your scary story reading, or if you're a big fan of K.R. Alexander or R.L. Stine, this would be a good one for you. So, Chapter 1, Gilbert Gets a Call. Gilbert Campbell was shelving books at the public library on the Upper West Side when his phone dinged. One new voicemail. His brother's message was garbled, mixed with static, but Gilbert was able to make it out. Tell you, important, whatever you do, don't listen to the tapes. Explain more when I. And this was followed by about 30 seconds of soft hissing. Gilbert played the message again, and then again. Was there panic in Aunt's voice? Or did it only sound that way because the recording was messed up? It was the week of winter break, and holiday festivities had come and gone. Gilbert and his best friend Percy had been planning on playing video games and catching up on their favorite shows, but he hadn't thought to ask Mrs. Effiong for the time off. A bummer, especially since this particular library was up by their school and nowhere near home. His mom and dad were away on vacation, and Grandma Rosemary was visiting. This wasn't a bad thing. Grandma Rosemary didn't mind TV binging or video games, and in fact, she often joined in. The problem was that whenever their grandmother looked after them, Gilbert's older brother tended to act out. Whatever you do, don't listen to the tapes. Aunt had said that. Which tapes? Gilbert wondered. Before returning the call, he had noticed that Aunt's message was from very early that morning, before dawn, but it had only just arrived. Weird. The line rang and rang. Shivering, he returned to the shelving cart, deciding to grill Aunt later. Since his shift was nearly done, only 3 books were left. The Secret of the Stone Child by Nathaniel Olmsted, The Clue of the Incomplete Corpse by Ogden Kentwall, and something called Elsewhere Gardens by an author named October Bowen. This last one he handed to Mrs. Effiong across the counter. I'd like to check this out before I go. It's for my best friend. Percy was a self-proclaimed botanist in training. Once, they'd said, what in the world is more hopeful than a garden? Gilbert loved that, and Mrs. Effiong's big brown eyes glinted as she scanned the copy into his account. Gilbert's phone dinged again, and it was a message from Percy. Their ears must be burning. My mom wants to know if you can come over for pizza later. Gilbert typed back, sure, I'd love to have pizza with your mom. Will you be there too? Har har. Mrs. Effiong tisked as she slid the book back to him. Gilbert, you know I don't like our volunteers on their phones. I just have to check in with my grandmother. I'll be quick. When Gilbert pulled up Grandma Rosemary's contact info, the phone buzzed in his hand. She was calling. Ignoring Mrs. Effiong's frown, he swiped to answer, to say something about the cheerful coincidence. But his grandma sounded frantic. Where have you been? I've called and called. Service is spotty in the library. What's wrong? It's Antonio. His brother's strange voicemail crackled through Gilbert's memory. Is he okay? Do I sound like he's okay? Grandma Rosemary sighed. I'm sorry, sweetheart. It's just, he got hurt. How hurt? We're in intensive care. Please come, she told him the hospital name. The entrance is by the river. A map of the city flashed through his frazzled mind. I'll catch the bus. I have to get in touch with your parents. There was a click. She'd hung up on him. Everything all right? Mrs. Effiong asked. Gilbert felt like he was floating. His skin had gone all prickly, and he thought of Aunt's face, his bulbous nose, stubborn acne, and dark fuzz on his chin. His curly black hair that faded to the skin just over his ears. And then Gilbert's brain did a frightening thing. It covered Aunt's face in red, wet and sticky, like in horror movies. Gilbert? Mrs. Effiong's voice came again. What's the matter? Gilbert clutched the counter's edge and then slipped Percy's botanical book under his arm. My brother, there was an accident. I have to go. Mrs. Effiong's hand drifted toward her mouth. Is there someone I can call? My grandmother wants me at the hospital. Gilbert's voice sounded as if it belonged to someone else. And my parents are, let me give you cash for a cab. I have a Metro card. I'm not sure I feel comfortable. I'll be fine, I promise. And he retrieved his coat and scarf and hat from the chair behind the circulation desk. You have my cell number? The librarian asked. Strange how those were the words that should make his eyes sting. I do, he answered, fighting to look all business. Text me when you get where you're going. An accident. Intensive care. Big brother. He shook the thoughts away, then tossed a nod to Mrs. Effiong. If he stood there any longer, he knew he'd break. At the landing, he pushed the door open, and cold air rushed into the library like a gasp. Snow flurries started when the crosstown bus finally stopped. Gilbert tugged his scarf tight and trudged to the hospital entrance around the corner. A security guard pointed him to the second floor. Upstairs, Gilbert stepped into a busy corridor. His phone chimed with a new message from Percy. My mom wants to know what toppings you want. Meatballs, peppers, olives. Percy. In the rush to get here, Gilbert had forgot to tell them about Aunt's accident. My brother's in the hospital. Oh my God, is everything all right? I'll text you in a bit. Percy answered with a bunch of question marks, and Gilbert was filled with a bunch of question marks himself. He remembered to text Mrs. Effiong, and then crept to the rooms the security guard had mentioned. The door was open wide, and inside, a dim light hung on the wall over a headboard. A large silhouette was standing between Gilbert and the room's occupant. A nurse? A doctor? Gilbert knocked. Hello? The figure straightened, and then bolted to a hidden corner of the room. Startled, Gilbert grabbed the doorframe and nearly dropped the library book for Percy that he realized he was somehow still holding on to. Finally, he saw his brother, and any notion of the shadowed figure flew out of his head. Tubes and hoses and bags filled with clear liquids hung from hooked stands on either side of the bed where Aunt was lying. His eyes were closed, and an oxygen mask covered his nose and mouth. Gilbert took Aunt's hand. What happened to you? A noise came from behind him. He turned to find a closed door. That shadowed figure. Was this where they'd gone? A small placard read, restroom. He looked to his brother. A large bandage covered Aunt's lower left cheek. Another was taped to Aunt's throat, snaking beneath his hospital gown. The skin around Aunt's eyes was purple with collected blood. The noise came again. Fabric rustling? Wind through air vents? Wings fluttering. Who's there? Gilbert asked. And when no answer came, his hope that the person was a nurse or a doctor or even his grandmother evaporated. Nervous, Gilbert glanced around for something to block the door. The wood-framed chairs at the corner wouldn't be heavy enough. Then the latch clicked, and the bathroom door opened a crack. A sliver of black. Gilbert sidled against the wall beside the door, out of the sightline, and listened to the nothingness within. A moment later, he clasped the library book like a baseball bat, yanked open the doorknob, and shouted, "Hi-ya!" A toilet was against the far wall, a chrome handle attached to the tiles. A corner sink stuck beside a cramped shower stall. No one was there. He looked to Aunt with a nervous grin. Had he really shouted, "Hi-ya"? You'd better not remember that, he whispered to his brother. He flicked the bathroom light switch. In the shower stall, a leather satchel sat, sagging in on itself. Curious, Gilbert flipped it open. Inside, a few objects glinted. Plastic. Angular. He held one of them to the light. At first, he wasn't sure what to make of it. A rectangular thing no bigger than his own hand. And then his mind was whipped back to the garbled words of his brother's voicemail. Don't listen to the tapes. These were cassettes. Tapes like the ones Grandma Rosemary kept in a box in a cupboard in her living room next to an old boombox. Gilbert upended the satchel onto the floor. 2 more cassette tapes clattered out, followed by something larger, heavier. The player was bright yellow. Walkman and AM/FM were stenciled onto its side. A set of headphones slipped out too, attached to the player by a thin black cord. Totally retro. Did the bag belong to Aunt? Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Gilbert shoved the bag's contents back inside, along with the library book. He turned off the bathroom light and then stared out through the crack in the door. The person who appeared was small. She placed a paper bag on the table beside the hospital bed, let out a sigh, and then ran a hand across her short, graying hair. Clutching the satchel straps, Gilbert elbowed the door open and said, "Hi, Grandma." She startled. "Oh, honey, you scared me." Something told him not to show her his discovery, so when she hugged him briefly, he dropped the satchel and nudged it under the bed. Her eyes were pinkish. I grabbed us some coffees. Gilbert took the cup, even though he didn't drink coffee. He glanced at his brother again, all of his worry rushing back. What happened? Here's what Grandma Rosemary told him. That morning, before work, she noticed Aunt's door was open and his bed made. Antonio's absence didn't surprise her. He'd often crash at a friend's place if it got late and he was sleepy. But when Aunt didn't answer his phone, she'd fretted. She almost woke Gilbert, but didn't want to worry him. Then, at her office, she reached out to some of Aunt's friends. By noon, she'd begun contacting emergency rooms. Someone had found Aunt on a subway platform sometime before sunrise. He'd been unconscious from the start, his skin marked with strange wounds, deep gouges and scrapes. The IVs now connected to his arm were filled with antibiotics and saline and some medication for pain. As soon as Grandma Rosemary took a breath, Gilbert asked, "Did you get in touch with Mom and Dad?" "They're booking a flight back." "Is he going to be okay?" "The medicine will do what it's supposed to." There was something in Grandma Rosemary's voice that felt like a lie. Together, they held Aunt's hands. Gilbert felt Aunt's pulse just below the skin under his knuckles. Faint. He thought again of the voicemail his brother had left him, about the tapes. What else had it said? Aunt had been keeping secrets, that much was clear, and it wasn't only the past 12 hours that proved it. In the weeks leading up to the holiday, Aunt had been acting funny, quiet, tired. Even his friends had called him out on it. Last week, Fernando and Rosalie had stopped by, and Gilbert could have cut the tension between them with a laser beam. Unfortunately, most warning signs are recognizable only in retrospect. "What now?" he asked. "We wait," Grandma said, reaching for her coffee. That was one thing Gilbert was not willing to do. In the hospital cafeteria, he bought a chocolate chip cookie and a small bottle of apple juice. When his phone chimed yet again, he ducked toward a secluded table near the tall windows. "Any news?" But Gilbert didn't want a whole back and forth just yet. Instead, he stacked the cassettes on the table. The labels read, "More tales to keep you up at night," and each was numbered 1, 2, 3. "Don't listen to the tapes." Gilbert opened his voicemail app and played the garbled message again. Clearly, these were the tapes. He thought of Aunt, stubborn and silly and oftentimes rude. And then he banged his fists on the table and the stack of tapes rattled. How could you ask someone to not listen to something and then leave that very thing for them to find? But his brother had been unconscious when they'd brought him here, which meant what? That the dark figure at Aunt's bedside had really been there? That they had left the satchel for Gilbert? And if so, didn't that mean he should heed Aunt's voicemail? He took a deep swig of apple juice. Aunt had mentioned the tapes in his last bit of communication. That had to mean something. Gilbert needed to figure out what that something was. Unlike the earbuds Gilbert was used to, the Walkman's phones had wide foam pads that hugged his head like muffs for cold weather. He propped open the player, reached for the tape marked 1, fit it inside, and then closed the Walkman's lid. When he pressed play, a warm, not unpleasant voice, expressive and musical, masculine, with a hint of a rasp, began to speak, as if directly to him. And the rest of the book goes through the tapes, so they are numbered as you count down through these stories. Again, it's a really good, fast-paced, quick read. If you like scary stuff, be sure to come by the library and check it out.